not enough on its own. I love the drums, the bass, and all sorts of other instruments, but
David Gilmour is known for many things: his haunting guitar solos, his calm demeanor, and the transcendent soundscapes he helped create with Pink Floyd. But behind the serene exterior lies a man with sharp opinions and a quiet, smoldering disdain for pretense. Gilmour doesn't rant. He doesn't throw punches in the press. But when he doesn't like something, his silence is louder than most artists' outrage. And over the years, there have been certain bands, some iconic, some infamous, that didn't just rub him the wrong way. They represented everything he stood against. Whether it was because of musical arrogance, artificial hype, or artistic shallowness, Gilmour held a quiet grudge. And now, through decades of interviews, offhand remarks, and moments caught on record and film, a clear pattern has emerged. This isn't about petty rivalry, it's about principle. For Gilmour, music is sacred. It's about soul, substance, and sound that cuts to the bone. So when he encountered bands that chased fame over feeling, ego over artistry, or image over integrity, he didn't hide his contempt. Sometimes it was subtle, a sarcastic smile, a backhanded compliment. Other times he was brutally honest. Now for the first time we're unpacking the truth. These are the 6 bands David Gilmour couldn't stand, and the reasons why will surprise you. The first band that quietly earned David Gilmour's disdain was none other than Kiss, a group that stood for everything Gilmour rejected about the music industry. While Kiss dominated the 1970s with bombastic stage shows, theatrical makeup, fire-breathing antics, and merchandise that outpaced their actual music, Gilmour looked on with a mixture of disbelief and disapproval. He never attacked them outright in the press, but his body language and tone whenever their name came up said enough. Gilmour, a purist to his core, believed in the soul of sound, in emotion over exhibition. For him, the purpose of music wasn't to sell toys, action figures, or pinball machines. It was to create an experience that moved people. And in Kiss, he saw not artists, but marketers in leather suits. He reportedly once scoffed during a conversation about the band, muttering that they dressed like clowns and played like amateurs, a sentiment that echoed the views of many rock purists who felt Kiss had hijacked the integrity of the genre for the sake of commerce. To Gilmour, authenticity wasn't a luxury, it was a non-negotiable. And the fact that Kiss leaned so heavily on gimmickry made them, in his view, the antithesis of what serious musicianship was about. It wasn't just the makeup or the pyrotechnics, it was the music itself. Gilmour found their sound derivative, their lyrics shallow, and their image exhausting. He once remarked in private that he couldn't imagine Pink Floyd ever stooping to such circus-level nonsense just to fill stadiums. Where Floyd explored human emotion, isolation, time, death, and madness, Kiss shouted about partying every night and loving it loud. It was juvenile, empty, loud for the sake of loud, and yet the band soared in popularity, something that seemed to frustrate Gilmour even more. The idea that a band so theatrically hollow could achieve such massive success was a sign to him that the industry was slipping. It's worth noting that Gilmour was never a man of jealousy. He didn't envy Kiss's success. He pitied it, because for him, there was no beauty in smoke and mirrors, only sadness that audiences were cheering for an illusion instead of a connection. While he never launched a public tirade, he didn't have to. Gilmour's silence was his statement. He didn't share stages with them, didn't name them among his peers, didn't include them in the conversation when talking about what mattered in rock. And to those who knew him, that quiet omission said more than any headline ever could. Kiss may have been rock gods to millions, but to David Gilmour, they were just noise with a costume budget. The second band that earned David Gilmour's quiet but unmistakable contempt was the Sex Pistols, the brash, anarchic faces of British punk who detonated onto the scene in the late 1970s, with an attitude that demanded attention and a sound that, to Gilmour, barely qualified as music. To him, it wasn't rebellion, it was recklessness dressed up as art. Where Pink Floyd meticulously layered soundscapes to explore the human psyche, the Sex Pistols screamed into microphones with 3 chords and a manifesto that felt more like a tantrum than a movement. Gilmour never pretended to understand punk, and he never wanted to. In his mind, punk was a reaction, not a creation. A cultural middle finger that mistook noise for substance. What irked him wasn't just their raw sound or chaotic energy. It was their smugness. Their deliberate rejection of musicianship. Johnny Rotten's mocking of Pink Floyd, famously wearing a "I Hate Pink Floyd" t-shirt, didn't help either. Gilmour was never one to bite back in the press, but he didn't need to. He made his opinion clear in interviews, often describing punk as anti-music and suggesting, with a smirk, that knowing how to tune your guitar shouldn't be optional. To Gilmour, the Pistols weren't a threat to the establishment. They were a sign that the art of songwriting was being sacrificed to spectacle, that anger was being sold without nuance. He believed deeply in the craft, the hours of thought, the precision, the emotional layering, and the Sex Pistols, by his standards, had none of it. Yet what frustrated him even more was how critics hailed them as saviors. Saviors of what? He wondered. Certainly not melody, not longevity, not truth. Their rise was, in his view, the industry's overcorrection, a desperate attempt to stay relevant by promoting shock over substance. And while punk was lauded as authentic, Gilmour saw it as just another form of branding, slapped together with spit and spray paint. He didn't deny their cultural impact, but he questioned their musical merit, their message, their staying power. Even decades later, when asked about punk, he'd dismiss it with a wave of the hand, or a knowing laugh, as if the whole genre had aged like milk. And if you're finding this dive into Gilmour's rarely discussed opinions as fascinating as we are, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more deep dives into rock legends, and drop a comment below about the artists you think Gilmour respected or rejected. Your voice matters in keeping these stories alive, because behind every stage light and solo is a shadow, the opinions, feuds, and silent rivalries that shaped rock history. Gilmour never needed to scream to be heard. His criticism was quieter, but it cut deeper. And in the case of the Sex Pistols, the cut was clean, cold, and permanent. The third band David Gilmour reportedly held in quiet disdain was Yes, the progressive rock powerhouse known for their grandiose compositions, technical virtuosity, and sprawling concept albums that often pushed the boundaries of what a rock song could be. On paper, Gilmour should have respected them. They were fellow Brits, fellow innovators, and fellow explorers of sound. But according to insiders and a few rare interview moments, Gilmour found Yes to be the embodiment of excess without emotional anchor. He never questioned their talent. Rick Wakeman's keyboard wizardry, Steve Howe's intricate guitar work, and John Anderson's ethereal vocals were impressive in their own right. But to Gilmour, it all felt hollow, overproduced, bloated. He once remarked that certain bands play like they're trying to prove something to a music professor instead of trying to move the soul. And those who knew him best believed he was pointing squarely at Yes. Pink Floyd, even at its most experimental, always had a beating heart beneath the abstraction. Pain, alienation, memory, war, time. But Gilmour saw Yes as losing the plot, burying sincerity beneath layers of technical indulgence and pseudo-spiritual lyrics that felt, in his view, more like performance art than real emotion. He disliked how their songs often stretched beyond 10, 15, even 20 minutes, compositions that felt more like puzzles than music. Gilmour had little patience for the musical one-upmanship that seemed to plague certain prog rock circles. To him, music wasn't a sport. It wasn't about playing faster, stacking more notes per measure, or crafting cosmic epics about interdimensional mysticism. It was about truth, raw, uncomfortable, simple, or complex, but always real. And that, he felt, was missing from Yes's work. He reportedly called one of their albums a technical showcase with the emotional depth of a calculator, a line so brutally dry it became legend among studio engineers who heard it firsthand. Gilmour wasn't alone in his criticism. While Yes had a cult following, there were plenty in the rock world who quietly rolled their eyes at what they saw as intellectual grandstanding. But Gilmour, unlike others, didn't just dismiss them because they were different. He dismissed them because he believed their music had lost the plot, that it was chasing complexity for its own sake, and perhaps what irked him most was how the band's identity was constantly shifting. Albums released with rotating members, chaotic concepts, and bloated arrangements that demanded more effort than reward. He saw it as a kind of musical arrogance, the idea that if you confused the listener enough, they'd assume you were saying something profound. But Gilmore never bought into that. To him, the most powerful music was the kind that reached you in the quiet moments, not the ones buried beneath 8 layers of synthesizers and 20-minute solos. So, while Yes fans celebrated the band as progressive rock royalty, Gilmore quietly declined every opportunity to collaborate, endorse, or even compliment them. Not because they lacked talent, but because, in his eyes, they had traded feeling for fireworks. And that, for a man like David Gilmour, was the ultimate betrayal. As we close this list of bands that quietly ignited David Gilmour's disapproval, we arrive at 3 names that may surprise even longtime fans: Oasis, the Eagles, and perhaps most unexpectedly, Queen. While each of these bands holds legendary status in the annals of rock history, Gilmour saw through the glamour, and what he saw didn't always impress him. Starting with Oasis, it wasn't just their brash sound or swaggering image that rubbed Gilmour the wrong way. It was their complete and utter lack of humility. He viewed them as a second-rate Beatles tribute band propped up by arrogance, media hype, and shallow songwriting that coasted on attitude more than substance. Noel Gallagher once described Pink Floyd's work as music for potheads in planetariums, and while Gilmour never publicly responded, his reaction in private was icy. He dismissed Oasis as loudmouths pretending to be poets, and to him, their rise was proof that rock was devolving into imitation over innovation. Then there was the Eagles, a band Gilmour simply found dull. He never denied their success, nor their precision as musicians, but to him, their music was sanitized, corporate, and empty of the emotional depth he valued so fiercely. "They play as if every note was written by a lawyer," he reportedly said during a dinner conversation in the early 2000s. Gilmour disliked how the Eagles became the soundtrack of commercial America, polished to perfection, yet utterly disconnected from anything visceral. And finally, Queen, a band Gilmour admired for their talent, but struggled to stomach for their theatricality. He respected Freddie Mercury's voice, yes, and acknowledged Brian May's skill, but he often felt Queen were more interested in spectacle than storytelling. He once hinted that their songs sounded like rock operas for people who don't like opera and barely understand rock. What frustrated him most was how Queen turned performance into parody, losing sincerity in a sea of pomp and costume changes. For a man who believed in the sacred simplicity of a guitar solo that meant something, Queen's pageantry felt exhausting. In all 3 cases, Oasis, the Eagles, Queen, Gilmour's judgment wasn't born from rivalry, but from a deeper artistic code. He believed music should move the soul, not just entertain the crowd. He wasn't offended by success, but by shallowness, masquerading as genius. And in a world increasingly drawn to spectacle, ego, and nostalgia, David Gilmour stood like a quiet sentry, guarding the idea that music at its best must always be honest. He never screamed into microphones or penned angry op-eds. He didn't have to. His silences, his absences, his refusal to engage, that was the message. He let the guitar speak for him, and if you listened closely, you could hear the verdict in every note. These weren't just bands Gilmour disliked. They were warnings. Warnings about what happens when image outweighs soul, when imitation replaces authenticity, and when the love of music is eclipsed by the hunger for fame. Because for David Gilmour, the greatest betrayal wasn't a bad song. It was forgetting why the music mattered in the first place,